shop for summer clothes. Think pink, think pink if you want that kelp for shows. Red is dead, blue is through, green's obscene, brown's taboo, and there is not the slightest excuse for plum abuse or chartreuse.
G'day gorgeous. So this week I've been talking to lots of people about relationships, and one of the things that I find most fascinating that we kind of keep perpetuating in our society is this idea that love conquers all. So there's this idea that if you just meet somebody and you fall in love, which is what we're told, you know, we need to find that perfect match for us when we're young people, and you connect with somebody, and that whole idea is this the one? Is this crazy notion that we seem to have in our society that says that there's one person out there for all of us, and if we don't connect with that right person, or we connect with them and it doesn't work out, that somehow that's the end and we don't get another opportunity. I'm here to tell you that the idea that there's plenty of fish in the sea is real. Not just because there are many people out there who are open to having different sorts of relationships, but because you can't always be able to match with somebody just on love. It's not that you don't care about them or what happens to them, but in all honesty, most relationships are actually some level of business partnership, or some notion that moving forward you actually have to have shared goals, shared values, and, you know, a shared idea about where you're going to end up in terms of where the relationship takes you. As a young person, when you're together, you often don't think about those things, right? As a young person, you might meet in high school, you might be high school sweethearts. You're just all caught up in the romanticism of it all and the emotional connection. And then when things change and responsibilities come, sometimes that whole romanticism that was there when you were in your teens and it was just the two of you making out all the time and having a good time at it, just stops actually being relevant anymore. You're growing up, you've got responsibilities. And often we find that at that point in time, two individuals who seemingly had this really great relationship suddenly start to have issues. Because you know what? As teenagers, you're never going to ask the questions of, so, do you think that we should actually try and buy a home and have a secure roof over our head, or are you happy renting for the rest of your life? Do you actually want to settle down somewhere and have children, or are you just hoping that you could travel the world for the rest of your life and be a free spirit? Do you want to have children when you're young because there's health issues or family concerns, but, you know, maybe somebody else wants to have them when they're older and be able to travel and live their life first? That issue is one that we absolutely don't educate our children about. We don't teach them about the kinds of things that are going to impact on their relationships when they're young. And on the flip side of that, when we come out of a relationship and we're looking to get into another relationship, we often find that we're drawn into the same things that we had in the previous relationship, but somehow we kind of package it up as looking different somehow. So it's different or it's better because of something. And yet often the underlying issues around that relationship end up being the same. So for example, my first husband was an alcoholic. When I met my next partner, my big issue was to make sure that my partner didn't drink. But that partner used to smoke a bit of marijuana, and his emotional disconnection as a result of his own issues was much the same as it was for the alcoholic, right? So the difference between the two were really pretty minor. But in my head, I'd had it that they had to be different, right? Because they walked and talked and looked different, but the underlying issue was still exactly the same. So the conversations I have with women who are coming through that midlife phase and they've come out of a relationship and they weren't happy and they didn't get what they wanted and they want to go into a new relationship, they don't actually often sit down very often and think about, well, what do they want for themselves out of this relationship? What's the kind of connection that they want? And are they prepared to bare their soul and expose themselves in a vulnerable way to share that with another human being? Because guess what? If you share it, you might be rejected by that other person. So a lot of people hold themselves back. They don't want to talk about the things that they really want, the things that they really need in a relationship, for fear of this rejection. And for fear actually of exposing themselves and being vulnerable and then being hurt by that. And one of the things Brené Brown in her talk in TEDx, she talks about vulnerability. It's exactly that idea. You cannot experience joy unless you're prepared to open yourself up and be vulnerable. But in opening yourself up and being vulnerable, sometimes that connection that we seek, if we get it on some level because we've exposed ourselves and been vulnerable a little bit, we then feel that we're drawn in and this person has supported that component of our vulnerability, and therefore we need to accept everything else around them as being something that, even though we might not like it, we're going to have to deal with. So let me give you an example. I talk in the book about the fact that sometimes when you come into a relationship later in your life, you make compromises about things that you probably shouldn't compromise about. Now, I'm not saying you can't compromise, because let's face it, all relationships are compromise. At some level, you have to compromise yourself at some point. And that's an okay thing. That's actually what makes us human beings. But in my situation, my daughters are grown up and left home, and I no longer have that responsibility. When I'm looking at meeting somebody new, I have been in situations where I meet people who are of a similar age, or maybe a little bit younger even than I am, and in some cases older than I am, and they've got younger children. Now, I'm not opposed to people having children. That's not the issue here, and I'm not a selfish, self-absorbed kind of person. But the reality is, I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to experience other cultures. I want to be able to pick up and take off overseas and live for several months if that's what I want to do. I want to go away for weekends. I want to, be free to pick up and do the things that I want to do. And I don't want to feel that I have to make consideration for, weekend sporting events and all of these other things that impact when you have younger children. Even the shared care arrangements, sometimes you can make allowances because you might only have them half the time. And maybe you can work with that. But you have to be clear on what it is that you want for yourself and what the other person brings. But just because you meet somebody, you have sex, you think, oh, I'll just hang out with them because there hasn't been any better option more recently, doesn't a relationship make. And a lot of women that I talk to are too afraid to actually be able to step back and say, this is what I want for myself. I want to be able to meet somebody who is emotionally available. I want to be able to meet somebody who's secure in themselves and understands who they are as a person. I want to meet somebody who has a similar financial perspective to the way that I approach money. I want to meet somebody who sees that in 10 years' time, when they have grandchildren, they'd like to live close and be absolutely on hand to spend time with those grandchildren. Or alternatively, I want to meet somebody who sees that just because they have grandchildren, that doesn't define how they're supposed to live their life, and they can still go on and travel and do all of those other things. And I get that at some point in the future, because it's in the future and we don't know what the future brings, we're going to have to make some compromises and some adjustments. I always say to clients, your future needs to be a bit of a hand-drawn map on a crinkled up piece of paper with the pen in your hand. And then at some point where your goals about where you wanted to go, they want to change because you wanted to change, it's okay at that point to kind of change the way the map looks. It's your map. You can do that. But the thing that you should not do is compromise yourself just because you don't want to be alone. So therefore, you just forget your map, screw yours up and throw it in the bin, and completely 100% adopt somebody else's map. Because that's their dream. That's their life. That's their goal for themselves. And you could choose to be a part of it, but there has to be a marrying of those things. There has to be a shared goal, a shared outcome. As young people, if you get together and you decide to get married, one of the things you should be talking about is, well, how many children do I want? How do I feel about private school education? You know, do I want to stay firmly planted 5 minutes around the corner from my parents, or do I really want to go and live overseas for a while? Does my job mean that I need to travel internationally, and that means that my partner's going to be always left with the responsibility of children? How do they feel about that? Because the majority of issues that happens in relationships that lead to divorce is 100% about not having the needs met, because most of the time they're never discussed or addressed. We think we fall in love, this person, they love me, therefore everything else will just be perfect and we'll work it out along the way, because love conquers all. It's bullshit. Love doesn't conquer all. And in fact, the idea that love conquers all is actually why most people end up in a situation where they make compromises and stay in relationships that they shouldn't have ever got into in the first place, because they didn't ever give them what they need. So I feel like I'm on my soapbox this week, but it was a really interesting conversation I had with a couple of women last week around, you know, there's this idea about when you meet somebody that it must be about where you meet them, or the kind of work that they do, or their background, or their experience, or their life circumstances. And that there was this idea that if I had success meeting somebody in an online dating site, for example, then if my girlfriend went to that same dating site, then she could find the same kind of person. No, that's not how it works. You have to first get clear about your issues and put your issues and resolve them and work them through and know your own foibles, because I know my own foibles. I'm pretty clear on what they are. But then it's about, if you meet somebody, you need to be honest about what those foibles are. And you need to be prepared to be really upfront about, you know what, this is what I want. I've met some beautiful people whose life doesn't match mine. It's about my life journey and where I'm at and my life stage. And if that doesn't match up to where another person's life stage is, my decision to not enter into a relationship with that person has nothing to do with them personally. It's to do with the fact that their life stage and my life stage don't marry up. Can't. And in fact, if I compromise myself and make it so that my life stage marries up with theirs, I'll end up resenting them. And that's not fair to anybody. Not to you, not to them. And you've kind of pushed yourself through this sausage mincer to make a relationship out of something that compromised from the beginning. I hope that was interesting. I hope it's something that's really useful for you. And I hope that if you found it useful, that you might be able to share it with your friends. All right, gorgeous. Have a great week. Funnily enough, talking about relationships, I'm off to a wedding. All right, gorgeous. See you soon.
Pink for cheeks and pink at your lips, pink for shirts and all of your slips, just a touch of pink at your knees, and if you please, what? Pink chemise.